When the pressure to be perfect becomes too much, some break under the weight. But in this case, the break was deadly, and it came from within the family. This video reveals how a simple feeling can spiral into something dangerous, turning a once loving bond between siblings into a deadly confrontation. Why did a caring brother end up taking his sister's life? And what pushed him to commit this brutal crime? Let's dive into the details. In the quiet suburban town of Mumbai, the Sharma family appeared picture perfect. Rohan, 17, and Priya, 15, siblings separated by just 2 years, grew up in a household filled with love, ambition, and high expectations. Dilip Sharma, the successful doctor, always with a reassuring smile. His wife Anita, the picture of grace, hosting elegant dinner parties and keeping the home immaculate. Priya was the shining star, the pride of the family. She excelled in academics, was an accomplished pianist, and had even won several local awards for her paintings. Her success earned admiration from everyone, especially their parents, who often, albeit unintentionally, compared Rohan to her. Rohan, on the other hand, preferred the solitude of his room, his solace found in books and music. He was content in his own world. Although he was intelligent and talented in his own way, his achievements were frequently overlooked. Priya and Rohan loved each other deeply and always cared for one another. Being the youngest, Priya would often tease Rohan playfully, creating moments of laughter between them. But despite their close bond, Priya's teasing often reminded Rohan of the deeper insecurities he felt. She was the star, the one who excelled, and her playful jabs, though innocent, stung. While Priya's success was celebrated, Rohan silently bore the pressure of constantly falling short, of being overshadowed. As their parents' pride in Priya grew, so did Rohan's hidden resentment, slowly turning their once loving sibling bond into a ticking time bomb. Outwardly, they seemed like the perfect siblings, but beneath the surface, Rohan constantly felt the weight of being treated like a second-class citizen in his own family. No matter how hard he tried, he could never match Priya's brilliance. Though their bond appeared strong, Rohan silently struggled with the growing pressure and resentment. While Priya basked in admiration, Rohan's insecurities festered, as he couldn't escape the feeling that he was always in her shadow. Priya's 10th grade results were nothing short of amazing. She had scored an outstanding 99%, making their father beam with pride. Just 2 years earlier, Rohan had managed to score only 87%, a respectable result by any standard, but it paled in comparison to Priya's near-perfect marks. The news reverberated through the Sharma house, a joyous symphony of congratulations and pride. The living room was filled with laughter, tears of joy, and the warm embrace of family. Dilip Sharma couldn't have been prouder. His daughter would one day become a doctor like him. Anita Sharma's eyes welled with tears, the culmination of years of tireless effort in nurturing her daughter's brilliance. She had sacrificed so much to see this day, and it was all worth it. But in the shadows, Rohan felt a familiar pang. It wasn't pride, but a bitter resentment that twisted in his gut. He had always been the one overlooked, the one in the background. It had always been Priya. Priya, the star student. Priya, the one who seemed to excel at everything she touched. Priya, the recipient of their parents' unwavering attention. Every achievement of hers was celebrated, every milestone marked with pride. Rohan, with his love for poetry and his quiet demeanor, was relegated to the background, his accomplishments dismissed as mere hobbies. His passion for words and his introspective nature were never truly appreciated. The imbalance festered, growing with each passing day, turning love into a toxic brew of envy and despair. Rohan's feelings of isolation deepened, and the chasm between him and his family widened. Rohan retreated further into himself, a prisoner of his own making. The isolation was both a comfort and a curse, a place where he could hide from the world, but also from himself. The walls of his room became his confidants, silent witnesses to his growing despair and frustration. On a cold evening in November, the Sharma household prepared for another celebratory event. Priya had just won a national art competition, and her parents were throwing a small party for her at home. Rohan, who had grown increasingly distant from the family, stayed locked in his room. The applause and laughter downstairs felt like knives digging into his heart. Every cheer for Priya only amplified the resentment that had been festering inside him for years. Later that night, after the celebration had ended and the house had settled into silence, Priya walked into Rohan's room. He was at his desk, scribbling aimlessly, his back to the door. Rohan had always been the quiet type, but that night his silence carried a weight, an ominous, simmering hatred. Priya, still on a high from the evening, teasingly leaned against the doorframe. "You know, Rohan," she said with a playful smirk, "they've never thrown a party like that for you. Maybe it's because you didn't get marks like I did." She walked closer, adding with a laugh, "I'll be a doctor like Dad. And you, well, I guess you won't get to wear that white coat after all." Her words, meant to be light-hearted, pierced through Rohan's already fragile sense of self-worth. Rohan clenched his fists, his knuckles turning white as he tried to control the rage bubbling inside him. "Just leave, Priya," he muttered, his voice low and tense. But Priya, still caught up in her playful teasing, didn't stop. She laughed, oblivious to the fury building behind his cold stare. "Come on, Rohan, I'm just joking," she said, turning to leave the room, but her laughter had become unbearable. As Priya dashed out into the hallway, Rohan's restraint finally snapped. Overwhelmed by years of frustration, anger, and jealousy, he bolted after her, blinded by a sudden, uncontrollable rage. His footsteps pounded behind her as Priya, startled by the intensity in his eyes, quickened her pace, running down the corridor. She had no idea that her teasing had pushed her brother beyond the breaking point. The moment was no longer playful. It was deadly. Priya dashed into her room, giggling, thinking her brother was just being overly dramatic. She closed the door behind her, leaning against it and letting out a chuckle, still caught up in the playful banter. But Rohan stood outside her door, breathing heavily, his heart racing. The laughter that echoed from within felt like a taunt, amplifying the rage he struggled to contain. "This isn't a joke anymore, Priya!" he shouted, his voice a mix of desperation and fury. Rohan, fueled by a mix of anger and hurt, pushed the door open with a force that caught Priya off guard. The door swung wide and he stepped inside, his expression a storm of emotions. Without warning, Rohan grabbed a heavy trophy from her shelf, the very one she had won earlier that evening, and struck her on the back of the head. Priya collapsed onto the floor, blood pooling around her. But the initial blow wasn't enough. Overcome with rage, Rohan struck her multiple times, the metallic sound of the trophy hitting bone echoing in the silent house. Once Priya's body lay lifeless, Rohan panicked. He had acted in a fit of rage, but now he had to cover his tracks. He dragged her body to the bathroom where he staged the scene to look like a terrible accident. He left her lying in the bathtub to make it appear as though she had slipped and fallen. Rohan sat alone in his room, the weight of his actions crushing him from within. The sight of Priya's lifeless body haunted his every thought. Rohan felt a deep, paralyzing fear gripping his heart as he replayed the horrific scene over and over in his mind. He couldn't believe what he had done. His hands trembled, and the weight of his crime crushed him. The morning after the crime, the Sharma family awoke to a horrific scene. Priya's parents found her body in the bathroom, covered in blood, and immediately called the police. The Sharma family stood frozen in disbelief. Their world shattered the moment they saw Priya's lifeless body. Mrs. Sharma collapsed, sobbing uncontrollably, her mind refusing to accept that her daughter was gone. The initial assumption was that she had slipped, hit her head, and tragically died. During the investigation, several inconsistencies caught attention. First, there were no signs of struggle or any accidental marks in the bathroom that indicated a fall. Second, the number of blows Priya had sustained to her head didn't align with an accidental injury. They were deliberate, forceful strikes. The blood spatter pattern also indicated multiple impacts, not a single fall. After the autopsy was conducted, the results painted a grim picture of the events that had unfolded that fateful night. The medical examiner's report confirmed that Priya had died from blunt force trauma, indicating she had been struck by a heavy object. The investigation began by interviewing the family. Rohan, who had always been quiet and withdrawn, seemed unusually composed during questioning. While the parents were devastated, Rohan's emotions seemed restrained. Police's instincts confirmed that something wasn't right. As the investigation deepened, Rohan's past behavior came to light. Friends and teachers recalled how Rohan had always seemed to live in Priya's shadow, often feeling overshadowed by her accomplishments. One of Rohan's close friends, Sahil, even mentioned that Rohan had once joked about wishing he could be rid of his sister. Though it seemed like an offhand comment at the time, it now took on a chilling significance. The investigators meticulously examined the scene of the crime, searching for clues that could point to the weapon. It wasn't long before they found a trophy missing. As the detectives delved deeper into Rohan and Priya's relationship, they struggled to uncover any clear motive or history of conflict. However, Rohan seemed unusually tense and withdrawn after Priya's death. His silence, once seen as his quiet nature, now felt heavy with something deeper. The detectives couldn't ignore this growing sense of unease. Since there were no signs of forced entry, and the autopsy confirmed that Priya's death wasn't accidental, the investigation immediately turned inward. Police knew that the killer was likely someone close to her, someone who had access to the house and could have entered her room without raising suspicion. At this point, all signs pointed towards a member of the Sharma family. As the investigators pieced together the timeline, they found that Rohan had been the last person seen with Priya before her death. The neighbors had heard nothing out of the ordinary, and the security footage from their home showed no intruders. With no evidence of an external threat, Rohan became the obvious suspect. When asked about the events of that night, Rohan's story was vague, filled with gaps. Rohan's behavior had always seemed off to those closest to him, especially as they began to notice how deeply the constant comparisons to Priya had affected him. The police conducted a thorough search in and around the house, leaving no stone unturned. This time, they made a crucial discovery: a missing trophy, buried beneath a large pot in the backyard. Though it had bloodstains, there were no fingerprints on the trophy itself. However, a shovel found nearby in the yard told a different story. It was covered in Rohan's fingerprints. With this new evidence in hand, the police once again brought Rohan in for questioning. Under the weight of the mounting proof and the pressure of the investigation, Rohan finally broke down. Tears welled up in his eyes, and with a heavy heart, he admitted the truth. It happened in a fit of rage, he confessed, his voice trembling. I didn't mean for it to go that far, but I just lost my temper. He recounted how Priya's teasing, combined with years of feeling inferior and overlooked, had pushed him to his breaking point. That night, when she had come into his room and made light of his struggles, all the bottled-up resentment exploded in an uncontrollable burst of anger. Rohan had grabbed the trophy in the heat of the moment, not thinking of the consequences. The realization of what he had done hit him immediately afterward, but it was too late. In a panic, he tried to hide the evidence, burying the bloodied trophy in the yard, hoping no one would find it. Rohan's confession left the room in silence. The tragedy was no longer just about a brother killing his sister. It was about the quiet destruction that years of jealousy, pressure, and comparison had caused within the Sharma family. Rohan's tears were not only for the life he had taken, but for the shattered pieces of a family that would never be whole again. In the end, Rohan was arrested and charged with the murder of his sister, Priya. The house was filled with grief as his parents watched their only surviving child in prison. They had lost both their children, one to death and the other to darkness. The story of Rohan and Priya serves as a harrowing reminder of the dangers of comparison and neglect. Rohan's envy and feelings of inadequacy, though unvoiced, grew into a monstrous rage that ultimately destroyed his family. The tragedy of the Sharmas wasn't just the loss of their daughter, but the slow, unnoticed breaking of their son. If you enjoyed this story and want to hear more gripping tales like this, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and turn on the notification bell so you never miss an upload. If you'd like to support the channel further and help us create even more in-depth content, consider donating through the link in the description.